Hello everyone, so today we are going to present about structural change and adjustment. Before we continue to the presentation, let me introduce our group members. There are Daniel Alexander, Viola Kanno, and Valerie Fabiolette. Moving on to the next slide, I will explain about structural change. So structural change refers to dramatic shift in the way a country, industry, or market operates, usually brought on by major economic developments. The key to effect a structural change is the dynamism that is inherent in that system. And the next point is the basic notion of structural change is that as development proceeds, productive factors move out of lower productivity activities into higher productivity. One limited application of this lens is to simply view development as the process of resource moving out of agriculture and into manufacturing. And also, structural change is often sparked by technological innovation, new economic development, global shift in the pools of capital and labor, changes in resource availability, changes in supply and demand of resources, and changes in the political landscape. Moving on the next slide, here you can see table 24.1. This presents gross domestic product of low, middle, and high income countries that split up between agriculture, manufacturing, and services. So according to this table, you can see that in low income countries there is no significant difference between each sectors over the years. Especially for the manufacturing, it tends to be the same except for in 2000 it is decreased into 11%. And for middle income countries, there is always an increase in demand of services, as you can see in the table. It shows an increase in each years. Meanwhile, in high-income countries, as development proceeds, the agriculture tends to decrease in each years. And of course, there is an increase in services. As you can see, from 79, it increased into 81. So according to this table, we can conclude that the low, middle, and high income countries have a similar results in demand of services. So we can take an example in our surroundings. And as the development proceeds, we want everything to be simpler and easier. For instance, the usage of e-wallet. It risen over the years, and because people prefer to use a modern ways rather than traditional ways that you need to carry your money. It makes more organized and easier to manage. That is why in the table you can see an increase in demand of services, because as technology develop, people expect they could gain benefit from that, in this case the services. Meanwhile, in agriculture sector, there is a negative impact. Probably the negative impact doesn't really occurs in low income countries, I think, because in low income countries the citizens in there mostly have a job as a farmers. So even though there is still a possibility of decline, however it is not as strong as middle to high income countries. Meanwhile, for middle to high income countries, they tend to avoid becoming farmers, especially in the high income country. As you can see in the table, the agriculture in high income country is the lowest among all of them. I think because the young generation prefer to be engineering, doctors, and etc. And there is a mindset that being a farmer often classified as a poor, so there is a tendency of them to avoid it, mostly because of the other jobs earns more money. This affects in decline of agriculture because the labor decreasing means they couldn't produce more supply. That is why there is a decrease of GDP in agriculture sector. Also, the income elasticity of demand for food is less than 1. So for example, a percent increase in income results in a less than 10% increase in demand for food. And the other reason is why agriculture declines with economic growth is that it tends to be less capital intensive than manufacturing. Next, there are traded versus non-traded goods. For the traded goods, the price determined in what markets and domestic consumption and domestic production can differ, causing a trade surplus or deficit. And for non-traded goods, it is determined in domestic markets and the consumption and production must be equal. So for traded versus non-traded goods, we'll explain further by my friends.
Hello everyone, I'm Daniel. I'm going to be explaining about internal and external balance in the case of Ghana. Okay, let's take a look at the figure, which reflects the concept of internal balance and external balance, which are directly relatable to the PPF diagram. So if you focus on the point B, which is the production there, the point is on the PPF rather than inside of the PPF. So it means that all of Ghana's resources are efficiently employed. And by that means, we can understand that this is internal balance. And if you focus on the C point, which is the consumption, the point is exactly the same as the point B. So it means that the consumption of tradable goods, or the point C, is exactly the same as the production of tradable goods, or the point B. And because of these two points are the same, it means that there's no trade deficit or trade surplus, which is also known as equilibrium. So with this condition, this means external balance. Okay, now let's take a look at the next figure, which is figure 243. Now the production point B is the same from the previous figure. It is still on the PPF, and that means there's internal balance. Now we have two types of consumption points. We have CTS, CTD. Now let's take a look at the CTD first. So if consumption is at this point, CTD, it means that the consumption of traded goods exceeds the production of traded goods along with the vertical axis. Now this implies that Ghana has a trade deficit. That's why we named the point CTD. Now to simplify a bit, we interpret this trade deficit as current account deficit. So let's take a look at the equation. Current account plus capital or financial account plus official reserve transactions equals to 0. Now based on this equation, if there's a current account deficit, there must be a capital or financial account surplus and or an official reserves transaction surplus. These can come from positive direct or portfolio investment balances or from drawing down foreign reserves. And for the second point, consumption point, that is CTS, if the consumption itself is at this point, then the production of traded goods exceeds the consumption of traded goods along with the vertical axis. So this implies that Ghana has a trade surplus, which is why we named the point CTS again. So again, to simplify the matters, we interpret this trade surplus as a current account surplus. So if there's a current account surplus, we know that there must be a capital or financial account deficit and or an official reserves transaction deficit. Now, this can come from negative direct or portfolio investment balances or from building up foreign reserves. So different with the previous figure, which is this one, right? In both the trade deficit and trade surplus cases from the this figure, there is external imbalance this time. So as always, consumption and production of non-traded goods are the same as we stated on the first explanation. Therefore, point C is either directly above or directly below the point B. Okay, now let's take a look at the next figure, 224.4. So to understand some issues behind balances of payments adjustments, we will consider that Ghana is in an initial position of trade deficit or current account deficit. So this condition is exactly depicted from the figure. So as you can see also that we now have price ratio lines. And the first one, PT, which is the price of traded goods, and then we have PN, which is the price of non-traded goods. And we have the lines, the price ratio lines, which is PN divided by PT, or you might say consumers as well as firms face the price ratio, or you can say that this line is the relative price of non-traded goods. Now, as previously stated, the vertical distance between B and CTD is sustained by a capital or financial account surplus and or an official reserves transaction surplus. And so Ghana has internal balance but external imbalance at point B and CTD in this figure. So there are difficulties that may emerge when the inflows on the capital account begin to disappear or if reserves are drawn down too far. Now let's suppose, for example, direct and portfolio investment decline or foreign savings falls. It is still possible for Ghana to maintain its current account deficit by drawing down its foreign reserves. However, this condition is clearly not sustainable. It can last only as long as the central bank has foreign reserves to sell. Eventually, the foreign reserves will be exhausted and the country will face a balance of payments crisis of the kind that we have discussed on the previous chapters. So how can Ghana adjust to this? One possibility comes from recognizing that the external imbalance problem comes from the demand for tradable goods being too high. And by recognizing this, Ghana could just engage in demand reduction to reduce the demand for tradable goods. And believe it or not, this policy is one that has often been suggested by the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, and also the World Bank to developing countries in these kind of similar situations. And there's a significant limitations here, and it is that demand reductions typically cannot be confined to trade goods alone. So in most instances, demand falls for both traded and non-traded goods. So what is demand reduction actually? So how can they reduce the demand? So demand reduction consists of reducing the income households have for consumption. So basically, minimize their income that they usually use for buying or for consuming stuff. So we have a new figure, 24.5. We have the consumption, which is CTD1, production B1, and the unsustainable current account deficit, TD1. So now let's suppose that Ghana succeeds in reducing household incomes to the value of production at point B1. And because of that, consumption would fall from CTD1 to CTD2. So the difficulty here is that there's still current account deficit equals to TD2, even though there's still unemployment at the new production point B2. So by removing the trade deficit, therefore requires reducing incomes below the value of production at point B1, as mentioned before. And by doing that, we need to have further unemployment. So this is not actually a positive outcome from Ghana just by reducing the demand. So there's a key that's stated by Corden, 1986, is if it is desired to attain two targets, which is external balance and internal balance, it is necessary to have two instruments. The first one is the demand reduction that we have already talked about, and the second one is a switching policy, or you can say a change in the nominal exchange rate. And if you remember on the previous chapter, a devaluation or depreciation of domestic currency causes an increase in the domestic prices of both imports and exports. So based on this theory is when the cedi or the domestic currency of Ghana were to be devalued or depreciate, then the relative price of tradable goods is increased and the relative price of non-tradable goods is decreased. So what are the effects of this? The first one, it increases the incentive to produce traded goods by the Ghanaian firms, and it decreases the incentive to consume traded goods by the consumers. And both of these effects tend to reduce the trade deficit. So, in conclusion, in order to avoid internal imbalance or unemployment, a successful adjustment program must combine both demand reduction and switching elements. So, I think that's all for my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. Bye.
Hello everybody, my name is Putu Kanno and I'm going to present the next part, the traded goods and growth. Some researchers have attempted the publishing a relationship between the production of tradable goods in developing countries and growth. We can visualize this argument in the figure 24.7 right here. The increased production of traded goods involved in the movement from the point B1 into point B2, which is right here. This causes a positive growth externalities. These have the effect of shifting out the PPF along the traded goods axis, which instead of economy coming to rest at point B2 and B2 and C2, it can end up at the point along the new PPF, such as in the B3 or the C3. You can see the arrow right here. The order of economic liberalization. So traditionally, structural adjustment programs have included the following components. First, the exchange rate depreciation or devaluation, the reductions in government expenditures, including reduction in public sector workforces, elimination of agricultural and industrial subsidies, and elimination of food and medical subsidies. Wages control to reduce demand and to prevent inflation. Elimination of import quotas and export taxes, reduction of ad valorem tariffs to moderate levels of 10 to 15%, the privatization of state-owned enterprises, and the liberalization of domestic financial markets. Subsequently, international economists have stressed that it's very important to pay attention on the order of economic liberalization. There is evidence said that failure to consider the order economic liberalization can significantly compromise the sustainability of adjustments policy. So here is one possible order of the economic liberalization. First, to seek a means of securing central government's revenue through broad-based tax, depreciate or devalue the exchange rate to initiative switching, clarify quotas on import consumer goods, and remove quotas on imports of intermediate and capital goods, selectively begin to privatize state-owned enterprises, liberalize the foreign direct investments components of the capital or financial account, and develop an effective system of bank regulations.
So, in this chapter, we can conclude that the growth and development process inherently involves structural change as resources naturally move into more productive sectors. This tends to involve a decline in agriculture as percent of GDP, an initial expansion and then decline of manufacturing as a percent of GDP, and an expansion of the service sectors as a percent of GDP. Productivity in all of these sectors is important, and both agriculture and many service sectors have the potential for productivity increases. Also, the adjustment of developing economies to external factors in the world economy is an important and difficult process. An overvalued exchange rate is generally not sustainable, and consequently external balance then needs to be restored. Achieving external balance by demand reduction alone will sacrifice internal balance and exacerbate poverty. Therefore, adjustment must also include demand switching achieved by a devaluation or depreciation of the domestic currency. And last, structuralists question whether the standard demand reduction or demand switching policies of the World Bank and IMF will work effectively in all cases, and their policy prescriptions call for measures to ensure that the key productivity investment are not sacrificed in demand reduction. I think that's all from our presentation. Thank you.